Now that we have a 2D representation of our skeleton, we'll need to extrude it into 3D. To do that, we'll need to determine what the plumb dimension is of our common framing members, or perhaps our largest framing members. I believe we'll be using 2x12s, for example, for the common rafters, and so we will create a plane here that we can set up our 7/12 pitch, then copy this guideline, 11.5 inches parallel, which will then determine our plumb dimension. Knowing the plumb dimension, we can turn our roof planes into a roof plane solid that has the appropriate thickness. To do that, we will use the joint push-pull tools, and specifically we'll be using the vector push-pull tool. So select all, select the vector tool, making sure that where it says finishing you have thicken selected. And then we will select it in this corner and drag it down the plumb dimension that we have predetermined. Now we have a roof plane solid, the appropriate thickness, and we'll clean it up a little bit. You might notice that some of the corners, the edges seem to be hidden, and that is because the joint push-pull tools tend to soften and smooth some of these edges. So we'll just select the eraser tool and hold down the shift and control keys at the same time and unsoften and unsmooth these edges. I'll unhide the skeleton and then select it and lower it just below the roof plane solid. And then I'll take one of the skeleton members and, using the push-pull tool, drag it up a little bit just so it's above the top of the roof. And then select another element, edit it, push-pull tool, double-clicking it to drag it up, and then I will just simply move through all the skeleton members doing the same thing. One thing to keep an eye on is sometimes when you use the double-click method with the push-pull tool, it goes the wrong way. And that's typically because the face is reversed of what you had been doing previously. In this case, we had the reverse faces. They are dark. In this case, it was a normal face, which was not dark. And so the trick is to reverse it, and then when you use the double click on the push-pull tool, it goes the right way. There you have it. This one here is a little high. We'll trim it down, though it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So now that we've extruded all our skeleton members, we need to trim them so that we only keep that which is within the first floor planes solid. Now the way I show you to do this in simple roof design is to make copies of the roof plane solid and then drag an individual copy underneath each and every skeleton member, explode it, and that's what we'll do here. I'll make 3 copies in this case, drag them to the skeleton, which looks like it got accidentally renamed, so I'll fix that. And I'm going to name one of these skeleton members something different other than group so I can identify it. Drag one of the solids into that group and then explode it. And then Control A to select all, and then intersect faces with context using a Control key. And then we just simply edit all the extra stuff that we don't need. And this works really well, but it is a bit time consuming. More time consuming than using the Solid Tools Trim tool, which I'll show you how to use next. Then of course good housekeeping is making sure that there are no reverse faces. In this case we'll select a face we know is not reversed, and then context, click, and select Orient Faces to make sure that everything has an appropriate face. Let's go over the trim tool real quick. I have 3 rectangles. I want to trim the middle rectangle so that it lies between the upper and lower rectangles. So I'll lower the upper rectangle a little bit so it overlaps, and likewise the lower rectangle. So I will pre-select the upper rectangle. This becomes object number 1, and anything selected afterwards becomes object number 2 that will be trimmed against object number 1. And then we'll do the same for the lower one. Pre-select, trim tool, select the middle object, and there it is, trimmed. In order to use the Solid Tools Trim tool, we have a little preparation to do. Right now we have the roof plane solid, and we'll need to create 2 more roof plane solids, actually an upper and a lower, so that we can trim the skeleton members against them. So we'll just select every face on this roof plane solid, make a copy of it, drag it over a little bit to work on it. And then we'll use the push-pull tools, in this case the vector push-pull tool, to thicken it up, drag it up some distance so it's high enough to cover all of the extruded skeleton members. We'll group this. And we'll call it roof planes upper. And we'll drag this back over to where it belongs, sitting on top of our roof planes. Make a copy, drag it underneath the roof planes, and we'll rename that roof planes lower. You'll notice that both the upper and lower are solids. This says solid group, and there is a volume. This is important because if they weren't solids, we'd have to make them solids. Solid Tools only works on solids. Sketchup says that a solid has a finite closed volume. So it's a group or component that cannot have any missing faces or faces that don't meet on an edge. But in reality, that means duplicate faces or duplicate edges or extraneous edges that have no purpose. I'll delete this face here to make this group non-solid. Then we'll use a tool I had you download called Fix Solid. You right-click, select OK, and then it fixed most everything. In cases where it doesn't fix everything, it highlights, so what is the problem, and you have to manually edit it. We'll select the lower solid, and then the Solid Tools Trim tool, and then roll through the skeleton members, trimming them against that solid. And then once we complete trimming against the lower solid, we will hide it, open up the upper solid, and then trim against it. Everything is now trimmed nicely. We now have skeleton members that are very well defined both on the top and lower faces, which is something that you may not want. If this is just going to be a rough framing job, then the bottom of the ridges, bottom of the hips and valleys might just be, straight dimensional lumber. So if you want to take the extra step to edit these, I'll show you how to do it. I find that it's easiest to go ahead and make a rectangle that we can use as a guide, and then set the axes. So put red in the long direction and green in the vertical direction. And then use the Align Group component plugin to make a copy of this, which is aligned along the member that you want to edit, in this case the ridge. This rectangle is too big, so I'm going to go ahead and make it smaller, a little more convenient. And I'm going to change the height of it to be the height of the finished ridge, in this case 15 inches. In fact, I'm just going to delete the bottom and extrude this 15 inches down. It's a little easier. Then we'll use the circle tool, our favorite circle tool, cut method. To trim the bottom off the ridge. So lock that in the horizontal context, extrude it out, Control A to select all, and then intersect faces with context, and then get rid of the junk on the bottom, as well as the circle itself. Unhide, and push-pull tool down to the bottom of our rectangle for a 15-inch tall ridge. And we'll do the same, but a little more quickly on this hip. And of course, you could step through all of the major skeleton members to do this if you choose. You'll save yourself a lot of time by cutting your seat cuts early in the process before you duplicate the rafters. And so what we do is we unhide the wall massing, rotate around to find a common rafter, and then determine the wall thickness, in this case 2x6 wall plus 5/8 inch sheathing, and then drag it up so that we have a decent sized seat cut and a decent size height of a plate. So just going to drag it up so the inside of the wall intersects with the bottom of the rafter. And then have a look at it quickly to make sure that we have a decent size seat cut. And do the same thing over here on the turret. For some reason it's not taking, so I need to do some SketchUp magic here to get it to recognize that that is a separate face. Drag it up. The standard method for cutting the seat cut is to edit the rafter, select a face, intersect the face with the model, and then select that, and using the push-pull tool, cut the seat cut and repeat. Now, for hips and valleys, it's a little different. You can't use the push-pull tool to do that. So the standard method there is to, in this case, select the wall massing, make a copy of it, and insert it within the group that is this hip. Then intersect faces with context so it all becomes one item, and then erase all the extraneous stuff that is the wall massing, and what you're left with is a very well-defined seat cut in that hip. As an aside here, you can see that all of these rafters and skeleton members are named different. And the reason is I had used the Solid Tools trim tool to trim them. And when it does that, it renames everything that has been trimmed difference. So here we're deleting all the extraneous parts of the wall massing that we had used, and there is our lovely seat cut. But an easier way to do this is to use the Solid Tools trim tool. Now, to use the Solid Tools trim tool, everything that you're working with, the rafters as well as, in this case, the wall massing, has to be a solid. And in our particular case, this wall massing isn't a solid, and so we have to edit it. We have to find out why it's not solid. So one thing you cannot have is extraneous edges and lines that serve no purpose. And so if you step through it and go to X-ray style mode to see within on the inside to see if there's any extra lines, we're getting a little clipping, so I'm using the extents tool to clear it up, and then having a good look in there to see if there's any stuff that doesn't belong. And despite our best efforts, if you look at the entity info, you'll see that it is still not solid. So we will use the Fix Solids tool that I had you install. Right mouse click, select Fix Solid from the context menu. Select OK. It has found 3 errors and fixed them. As you can see in entity info, it says solid group. Now that the wall massing group is a solid, I will select it and then select the trim tool, and then sequentially go through each of the skeleton members, selecting them and trimming them against the wall massing solid. It's time to spread out the rafters, and so we will find and unhide roof plan, and then grab the rafter, drag it over so its center is centered on the hip, and then pull it over 24 inches, and then copy it by typing the asterisk key and some number. In this case, the number wasn't enough, so we'll make copies of these and duplicate it. And we'll duplicate it again. And this layout isn't necessarily even, but that's okay for our purposes. 24 inches on center from one hip is good enough. Now we can trim each rafter individually, or we can group all of these rafters into one group and then explode each individual rafters group and then trim them all at once, which I think is probably a little more efficient way to do it. So we'll group them, and we'll select all of the individual rafters, explode them, and use the circle tool to trim them all at once. Then of course we have to go through each individual rafter and group it again. These are a bunch of common rafters that shouldn't be individual groups, they should be components. So we delete everything but one and turn it into a component, and then distribute it. And get rid of that duplicate. And now that each individual rafter has been either turned into a group or a component, we can explode the parent group and then move on to the next set of rafters. We'll start from the middle here. Now that we have the rafters spread out, we can trim them using our favorite circle tool, or we can use the trim tool. The trim tool is usually my preference. That's what we'll do on this bunch. Of course, with the trim tool, we have to delete whatever's left over. In this case, on that center one, we had two things to trim against, and it's just easier to use the circle tool to trim it. And I inadvertently deleted a rafter, so I just created a new one, trim it with the circle tool, and away we go. Now that we have these rafters defined, we can go ahead and select them, and then group them, and then use the scale tool to make a mirror image for the opposite side. In this case, when we group them, it assumes the axis of the parent group, which in this case won't work for us for scaling. And so what we do is we go into edit mode on that group of rafters. We select the axis tool, and then we go ahead and convert the axis to an axis that will work for us. In this case, we'll just go ahead and use the axis of the eve line here. And there it is. And then we can scale conveniently and make a mirror image. And then relocate to the opposite side. Place it down on the eve line, hold the shift key to lock it along that line, drag it over, and select the plane of the rafter opposite to align it. And we'll do the same on this end. We'll get rid of that rafter, which we don't need, clean up this little rafter. So we'll select these rafters, or at least the portion of the rafters that we require. We'll make them a group. We'll change their axes appropriately. And make a mirror image, and then drag it over and locate it where it needs to be. And then we'll trim them using the Solid Tools trim tool. Here I see a couple of jack rafters that need to be trimmed, and I decided to do it the hard way. Instead of just trimming it using the circle tool, I've decided to go ahead and make copies, stretch them, make mirror images, all that stuff. And so here I am doing that. And then we go ahead and do the rest of the rafters. Go ahead and copy them, stretch them in this case, trim them using either the circle tool or the Solid Tools trim tool as my whim dictates. There's no right way to do this necessarily, but often enough the rafters that need to be trimmed aren't solids, and so the circle tool is just more pragmatic than to try to make it a solid so that I can use the solid tools. Now in many cases it would be best for these rafters here to be made into components, and then we have duplicate components for obvious reasons that we've talked about previously. But you know, sometimes it just takes too long to do that, and so I often just make them all groups and then deal with turning them into components later. or not at all. Some people feel that everything should be a component. There should be no groups whatsoever, and there are good arguments for doing that. I find that components are mainly useful. Well, useful where they're useful. Useful where they save you time. I'm a little agnostic as far as whether things should be groups or components. Now these jacks are abutting a hip that we had trimmed the bottom of, so it doesn't fully capture the end of the jack. I've opted to use the trim tool to trim these, which means that I'm left with a little artifact, a little piece on the bottom that I have to go ahead and trim. You'll see it just a sec. There it is right there. And so, which means that I have to go back using the circle tool, which I should have used to begin with, to go ahead and trim off each little segment of each one of these jack rafters. Let's work on the round turret roof now. I want to take this rafter and I want to copy it around this arc, and so I need to find a center point. Collapse skeleton. And then I'm going to find the turret floor plan, which is hidden, and unhide it. Select the face, go to plugins, select this plugin that I had you download and install. It is add center point. There we go. So I want to take this rafter and I want to copy it around this ledger, but the rotate tool takes angular measurements, and so for me to get my 24-inch centers, I'm going to use the circle tool, lock it in this context. Well, let's use this edge here and drag it out, enter 24. So for a 24-inch radius, I'll select the outside of the circle, then using entity info in the segments, I'll enter 180 for 180 segments, enter to smooth the circle out. I'm going to select a rafter I'm going to copy again, press Q for the rotate tool, and then the control key for copy mode. Select this outside edge and rotate it around. And it looks like that right there is going to be the intersection of the circle and the rafter that I'm copying. So I'll drop it there, and then let's select this rafter again, then go back into the rotate tool and copy mode and do the same thing over here. And there's the intersection of the circle and the rafter. Drop it, and then type asterisk and then 30 for 30 copies. So they will all be on the 24 inches centers now. And we'll get rid of our temporary circle and then trim this rafter up against the valley. We'll need to trim these rafters as they intersect the wall and the entry roof. And so we'll start by unhiding a few things, the wall massing, the entry roof planes, and then have a good look at how things are working. So the entry roof is going to bear on top of the turret roof, and the turret roof is going to die into that side wall. So we need a ledger there. So we'll drag up this wall massing, using the control key, so that leaves that plane intact so we know where we started from. So I'll just draw a face here. I will group it and name it, edit it, and using push-pull drag it out to 1.5 inch thick, which will be the ledger thickness. And then using the solid tools trim tool, I will trim it against that turret roof plane, and then edit it to make that void solid, and then delete the stuff I don't want, and we're left with an ellipsoidal ledger. We'll also need a ledger on the back side, so we'll do the same thing. We'll shift to X-ray mode so that we can have a better idea of how to place this face. And I need to drag it up a little bit. And edit that front a little bit. Go ahead and make that angle a little more form-fitting. And edit it so we get the piece that we're missing. And of course we'll need to trim this a little bit because it intersects with the ledger, the curved ledger there, and then the previous ledger that we had already made. So my first inclination is to use the trim tool, but in this case it didn't work all that well, because the top of the tower roof here is actually curved. It has an arc, which leaves that little remnant right there, which means that the best solution for trimming these is the circle tool as a cut plane. Here we have an appropriate roof-to-wall solution with the rafters all trimmed nicely up against their ledgers. And then we'll just return this entry wall massing back to its original height. For the entry roof, we'll redo all the steps that we've done previously, but at high speed, so we don't waste any time. We'll create the roof plan here. And after drawing and distributing the two-dimensional skeleton members, we edit them so that they have the correct intersections in preparation for extruding them. Then we extrude them to a height above the top of the roof. Then we trim them. This time I'm using the old style method. And then we edit the roof frame elements to take care of a few details. Then we edit the rafters for the seat cuts. And duplicate the rafters, trimming them. Making mirror images of them where it makes sense too. Now we need to trim these rafters to the top surface of the decking, but this surface that we have here represents the top of the framing, not the top of the decking, so we have to create the decking. Here we have a plane that represents the decking. We're going to use joist push-pull, that plugin I had you download and install, to go ahead and create the thickness that's necessary for the decking. And there we have our decking. Move it back to where it belongs, and then we can go ahead and use the trim tool to trim these rafters to the top of the decking. And when it got to these rafters, our trim tool didn't work too well, so we'll revert back to using our circle tool. And there we have it. Everything is trimmed, so all the rafters are bearing on top of the decking. And then we'll move along here, just check everything out quickly, and also create the decking for the entry roof. We'll use the Follow Me tool to create the Frieze blocking. First, we find the first floor plan, unhide it, create a copy of it, rename it first floor Frieze blocking, edit it so that we have nice contiguous edges all the way around, a nice clean path, and we'll move it up to the bottom of the rafters. And then we'll go ahead and create the profile of the face that will then become the Frieze blocking. In this case, we'll make it a square Frieze block and not plumb. We'll double click on the face to highlight the edge, explode the face that we're going to extrude, extrude it around, and there we have it. And looks like we have a few things to edit and to trim. Of course, this fascia is one solid piece, and if you wanted to make these a bunch of individual Frieze blocks, you can. Let's do the fascia on this. It's going to be similar to how we did the Frieze blocking. Let's select the first floor roof plan, and we'll make a copy of it, paste it in place. Hide the original. Then we edit out all the stuff on the interior. All we need is the perimeter edge that we can use as a path to extrude the fascia on. This right here I had previously welded together, so the curve and the straight edges are all stuck together. I need to right click it and select the explode curve so that I can break it into its individual parts and then edit it. And we'll use a circle here to give us a surface to draw our fascia profile on, and we'll make this a square fascia as well. Give ourselves a 1-inch reveal. I'm checking to see if the edge segments are contiguous, and in fact it's easy just to go ahead and select it all and then weld it together. There, we did it. We extruded using the follow me tool. I didn't quite make it long enough, so I'm pulling that one edge out here, and I'm trimming the fascia against the ledger, which is actually a mistake. I wanted to go the other way around. I want to trim the ledger to the fascia, so I'll redo that. There we go. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use the Solid Tools trim tool to trim these rafters to the inside of the fascia. The problem is that these rafters were cut on a curved surface, so that is the plane of the roof is curved, and so the top of the rafters is curved as well, which means that the fascia is not going to be tall enough to be able to trim the rafters against. And the solution to that is to create a temporary fascia and drag up this top surface of it to make it a little taller. We will use Friedo's push-pull tools, in fact in this case the follow push-pull tool, to drag it up there, and now we have a fascia that's tall enough to capture the rafters, and then we will step through each rafter using the trim tool. In some cases we can't use the trim tool because the rafter is not a solid. So rather than try to fix it solid, we will just revert to using the circle tool and trim it that way. After stepping through each rafter using the trim tool, and then coming back and deleting the tails, or using the circle tool, trim method, and then editing the fascia a little bit, we have a completed fascia. I took the liberty of doing the entry fascia and frieze blocking offline. And there we have a completed first floor framing with frieze and fascia.